So hello, how are you guys today?
Doing great.
Doing good?
Doing well, yes.
Did you already pick up your turkey and already thawing it?
Yeah, I think my sister's working on that. So, yeah. So
Sumit, are you having turkey or anything? I don't know if you don't celebrate Thanksgiving, do you?
yeah.
Plus, I'm vegan as well, so
Yeah,
Oh, you're vegan.
that's
no
right.
turkey.
Hey, I tried to do vegan before. I only lasted about a month.
Yeah.
It's
So
hard
I've
to cook
been
vegan.
um, I've been vegan for about 3 years now.
yeah. So I hear with being vegan, or you just feel after you do the conversion, you feel more energetic. Would you? I mean, I guess it would be hard to say that. I mean, I can imagine feeling different after eating different, but of course I am. What are your experiences there, Sumit? Do you feel like is it being vegan? Is it it's a more of a cultural and in your belief system, or is it for your health reasons?
Um, so that's an interesting one, actually. So it's definitely not part of a belief system as such. I went vegan after adopting a dog and a cat, um, because I realized that you can't um, be selective in the compassion that you display to some animals and um, ignore the others. So, and it's also not only about the food part of it. So it's about not using any cosmetics that have animal testing or that have animal based ingredients in them. uh, no wool, silk, and any kind of fiber made from animals, and so on and so forth. So basically shunning anything which has animal ingredients. And um, there's a joke about that. So there's this, it's not necessarily about veganism, but there's this person who was um, who's talking at a party, and he's saying that I don't eat anything which has gluten, which has pesticides, which has artificial fertilizers, and um, any synthetic additives which shouldn't be there. So another person like Sam asks this individual, "Do you feel healthier? How's the experience? So how do you feel?" The guy says, "Hungry."
Yeah.
Well, I tried to do vegan, and I actually tried to do it during keto, and that was really tough.
That could be tough,
So
yeah.
it was, but I learned how to do it. But I think that we could have a topic on multicultural dietary needs. I was supporting a director once, actually in the Phoenix area, and in the Phoenix area, there was a break room, and all the employees were in the break room, and this department had about 50 employees, and this employee was in the break room cooking fish in the microwave. And as you know, in break rooms, if you cook fish in a microwave, it completely stinks up the entire, cafeteria.
That's right.
Um, and then apparently she also eats mice.
Oh,
So apparently on another day she would eat mice, and that was, I don't know why, but so the director called me, and he said, "Okay, Shar, you're probably the problem solving HR person. What do I do about an employee that eats mice?" And it's kind of, I want to offend her from a religious standpoint. So that was kind of an interesting thing,
yeah.
but we addressed it.
Yeah, it is different. I mean, from different cultures. I mean, and food happens to be the big one, right? Where it's
Yeah,
a bit
well, a
shock.
lot of employees were getting bothered and making complaints, and it was
Yeah.
one of the more unique HR questions I've had in my career.
Yes. I remember
Certainly interesting.
I was in
It is.
a Syrian restaurant once, and we were in there, eating, and the owner of the restaurant, there was a bird that flew in the restaurant, and
Oh
I'm
my
not sure
gosh.
not sure what kind of bird, but it flew in the restaurant, and so the owner was a Syrian and was going all the restaurant trying to get this bird, and she captured the bird, and then I guess it was a good eating bird, and so she took it in the back and dressed it and so forth, and had it for lunch, and so it
Oh,
was but it was kind of shocking for us, but it was quite normal for her and her experience. And so
interesting.
so it's those things that we have. I mean, that's why we're having this discussion today is to have that
Right.
awareness in different cultures. And I think, and you brought up a good point. Food seems to be shocking sometimes when we think
Right.
about different
Well, it
cultures.
is an aspect of diversity for sure. I think we have wild turkeys around here, these little guys. So if you hear some squawking, they walk by. Hopefully we won't be eating that. But my girlfriend here doesn't want to eat a traditional Thanksgiving dinner, so we're going to have something that's vegetarian.
Uh,
So
Seafood,
yeah,
all that.
food is weird. I was traveling to Singapore a couple of years ago, and they actually have laws which prohibit you from eating jackfruit in public. So
Oh,
jackfruit is I don't know if you've ever had it, but it it smells terrible. So they're fine with, of course, they're an island, so they're fine with fish everywhere and anywhere. But jackfruit, this is their sign saying you can be fined if you're eating jackfruit in public. Um,
well,
and on
I
the
thought
aspect
that
of,
that's
sorry,
really good for vegetarian and veganism, though, is jackfruit, right?
it is, but then you wouldn't find too many vegans in Singapore.
Good point. You know a lot about all these different cultures, that's for sure. That's why I'm super
So
excited for
specifically
today's
about
topic.
food, because I mean, one, people do make a lot of assumptions when you're from India, because they tend to assume that you'd have a certain kind of dietary preference because um, you're from there, and of course,
Okay,
every nation does seem to have their own individual quirks and differences.
right. Well,
yeah.
as a matter of fact, I think this is a very good conversation for Food Week here. And so I think it's at the top of the hour here. So I just want to say welcome to everybody. Welcome to our People Strategy Forums. We do this at the top of the hour at 10 a.m. Mountain Time. And just so happy that we've been doing this for, gosh, I think since the end of March, right before a lot of the world changes was happening. So thank you very much for joining us. We appreciate it. Also, just wanted to let you know, if you want to communicate with us, down at the bottom, there's a chat. We'd love to have you engage with us. We'll be following your questions and also addressing any topics that you'd like to address. So please put that in the chat. And we are the People Strategist Forum. So happy to be the mastermind of leaders dedicated to creating where people thrive and employers love, and also our customers love. So anyway, so just wanted to go ahead and get going today. So my name is Shar Miller. I am a people strategist, and I also do some side career coaching. And also I own a company called Rocky Mountain Health Advocates. And I have been partnering with Sam Reeve here, who is the founder and owner and CEO of CompTeam. And his team has done a fantastic job helping us with these forums all along. Also, she's not with us today, but we partner with Lisa Jackson, who's a cultural strategist with Corporate Culture Pros, and she's off enjoying her Thanksgiving week. And then also Sumit Singla, and he's joined us. And if you take a look at his background, he has been amazing with Deloitte and some other phenomenal organizations. So he'll be sharing that information as well. So let's talk about our topics today. So I think this is going to be a very fascinating topic. As a matter of fact, we were just having a conversation about this topic. It's about multicultural awareness and how it impacts performance in the workplace. So this is going to be extremely fascinating, mainly between Sam and Sumit, and I'll interject here and there. And so also at the end, we'll have some open Q&A and discussion for everybody. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get going.
Great. Welcome, everyone. And Sumit, feel free to take over the screen here. I know you might be able to control the slides a little bit better. But
Sure, Sam.
multicultural awareness, I think, is a really exciting conversation. We were just having a discussion earlier about just how we may have different perspectives based on our experience, and others may have different experiences and therefore different perspectives on the workplace and what's appropriate and what may not be. And this is even further shadowed by their personal experience. I mean, for instance, we might find something in a particular culture that's a standard in that social norm, but perhaps that particular individual in that country was from the farm community or a city community, which has their own cultural standards as well. So there's a lot of facets here, and it's easy to fall back on generalities, but we need to realize that even those generalities can be false in some certain circumstances. So what do you have to share with us here today, Sumit?
So this is a topic that I'm really fond of, Sam, multicultural awareness. And I think it's very firmly a journey. One can never really be fully aware of different cultures. One is always bound to make some errors, make some absolutely terrible mistakes, which could be laughable or even offensive in certain contexts. But it's a topic which, in a global and an increasingly remote um, style of working, I think it becomes more and more pertinent. So I do have some slides to run through, but it'll be great if I mean I do know we've got a global audience. We've got people from various parts of the world. So the more we can interact and call out different aspects and quirks of different cultures and how they translate into the overall workforce experience as well as specifically performance management, I think it'll be great. So with that, I'll just start off with a little quote from Brian Chesky, one of the co-founders of Airbnb. So I like this definition for its simplicity. So culture, what is it? It's simply a shared way of doing something with a passion. Another even simpler definition of culture I've come across is it's the way we do things around here. And I find these definitions absolutely beautiful because they stay away from jargon, they stay away from fancy management consulting speak, which we often are guilty of. And it's a definition that even a child can understand. And of course, no conversation about culture is complete without this quote from Peter Drucker. Culture eats strategy for breakfast. I'd assume it's a very, very dull breakfast because strategy, unfortunately, isn't the most palatable of concepts for typically for people who are not part of boardroom conversations. So my reaction to, I'm sorry, please go on.
No, I was just thinking when we're looking at all this stuff, I'm just thinking about the aspect of culture, because when we talk about it in a business perspective, I mean, we want to have people that have that is aligned to a certain purpose, a vision, and a strategy that has a culture of purpose, so that basically align towards that strategy. But then at the same time, we also covet the different opinions and experiences of others that can spark innovation in a company as well. So there's kind of like that duality that we're dealing with in this conversation, this topic.
Absolutely. And I think there's also a contradiction there. We keep talking about inclusion, we keep talking about multicultural awareness, but at the same time, when we're recruiting, we still try and recruit for culture fit. So we don't really recruit for cultural inclusion. It's more for fit, which could just be contradictory to the ideals of being more inclusive. And of course, like Shar is pointing out in the chat, Food diversity is an important part of being aware of what people eat. Um, for example, a vegan like me might just be up in arms if somebody offered me Thanksgiving turkey,
Yeah,
um, like Shar just did. So
that's right.
fair warning.
And that's that. Oh, go ahead, Shar, you're on mute.
Oh, I'm sorry. You're right. I think I need to be sensitive because remember I made a comment about a cow and you had to give me some guidance about mentioning cows too much. I think I said holy cow, right? And you were like, so, and it's like, you just remember that? And I wasn't trying to be offensive. It's just I was making some kind of comment and you were like, hey, just be aware that that might be somewhat offensive to some people.
Yes.
Well, I was just, in my defense, I was just joking, but yeah, it's when, I just suggest don't discuss cows when you've got an Indian in the room. You don't know who will get offended and why.
Right. And I think you have other participants that were on the line that day. So I really appreciate that. But, some of us are so in the dark. And I think that typically being an American, sometimes everything's so Americanized, you just have no idea that how you're being perceived.
Right. And Americans have a terrible habit of well, they're being almost culturally isolationists, I guess you could say, in some
Yeah.
aspect, where we believe that the American culture is so pervasive that we get caught up in it a lot. So for instance, thinking that if we're and that's the reason why we brought up this topic around Thanksgiving, because a lot of the things is Thanksgiving is a uniquely American holiday, and as we're talking about this in a global context, and those holidays that can be so dear to some of our people in a particular business or culture, how do we share or celebrate that and recognize the cultures of others in the same way? Because there's so many dear cultures out there that are enduring that we could all enjoy, and if we just simply communicate better and share more.
Right. And I would say as a lot of our organizations are going more global and hiring more employees, now that we're going to more of a remote workforce, the diversity of our employees, I think, is going to only broaden. And I think, Sam, you and I had a client last year where some of the employees were in India, some of the employees were in New York City. And, that was very eye-opening for me because we were talking about differences in communication and how we approach the employees. So, very, very interesting.
Yes. So tell us more about that, Sumit, because I know we're going to get into that. So let's continue on.
So since you mentioned Americans and an isolationist approach, Sam, I'm going to I'll start off with a little bit of a story about one such instance, and some of our audience members might have come across this story earlier. So it's about a fisherman and a businessman. So there's this fisherman chilling by the beach somewhere in Mexico, and an American businessman comes by and says, "Hey, what are you up to?" And the person says, "Well, I'm just relaxing after a hard day's work. I've got enough fish that I needed." And the person says, "Well, if you just worked harder, you could catch a lot more fish." And the fisherman says, "So you catch more fish, you'll have more profits, you'll be able to sell them, you will be able to save more money for a rainy day, you'll be able to improve your living standards and so on. And you're simply wasting time drinking with your buddies here at the beach, and there's no point to it." So the fisherman says, "All right, so when that happens, what next?" So this guy says, "Eventually your business will start flourishing from this rickety old boat that you seem to have. You'll be able to buy yourself a fishing trawler. Eventually you can set up a fishing company, maybe even go public in a couple of years. And you could just become a business tycoon." And the fisherman says, "All right, and then?" "Well, then you could retire in peace, sit by the beach and just have a nice time." So the fisherman raises his eyebrows at the guy and says, well, what do you think I'm doing right now?
Yeah.
So, so yeah, it's one of my favorite stories as well, because I mean, I think, and I mean, no offense to anyone who's American, but I think it does point to what's the westernization or maybe even the Americanization of the way we see performance and performance outcomes and success. So, um, and as we go deeper into conversations around what's meaningful for employees, it's important to remember that not everyone wants their lives to end in being CEOs and CXOs and owners of their own companies and floating public offerings and making money and sitting there. Uh, um,
One other
so
thing I'd add to this is it's also important to understand. I mean, even this can happen within a culture or within your own team. For instance, I had a couple of years ago, I had to sit down with a bunch of executives, and we were looking at uh, the business model and adapting the business model to what they were trying to accomplish. And through that course, people had some executives had the idea that they wanted to do this for the end goal, and we want to do this because we can be, for instance, rich in the future or whatever. and then you had other executives in the room that were in the journey for the experience through the journey. So there wasn't so much the hook, for instance, at the end of the journey. It was the journey itself that they wanted to get gratification from. And so a lot of two different perspectives in the room, and it was important that they came together at some element so that they could have that shared experience, but both had different perspectives.
absolutely, and I think that makes what you're saying makes absolute sense, Sam. Um, the other thing for I think a person in um, um, a role like the businessman in this case is to realize that they're not understanding the audience. So sorry, let me just.
Your
So
dog is your dog's
we need a little bit of multi-species awareness as well.
Yeah. Oh, I think that's a
Uh,
really good topic. Yeah, pet animal diversity.
no, I think they're having their own Zoom call where she's communicating with other people around. So
Oh, you're
um,
so funny. Yes, I think
maybe
that
I'm
would be a
interrupting.
good meme, pet Zoom call.
We do seem to have quite a lot of those. So soon enough,
Yeah.
you might just see a cat walking across my keyboard and wonder what's happened to the video and the slides and so on.
Well, I think that's becoming every day around all these Zoom calls.
Yes. I think it was just yesterday. My sister, which I'm visiting here in the Thanksgiving holiday in Phoenix. She has a house where there's a lot of birds in it, and they let their birds kind of fly around the house a little bit. They're little parakeets and so forth, and they're really enduring pets, But occasionally she'll be on a Zoom call, and one will land on top of her head, and she'll have.
Oh, that is hilarious.
Yeah, exactly. So talking about little interruptions here and there, and it's just a part of the life we live right now.
And again, bringing it back to what we're talking about right now, again, I think it's important when we're trying to be aware of multiple cultures to also be aware of any such possible interruptions, disruptions, and not necessarily having to apologize for anything of that sort. So, depending on which country, which part of the world you're from, you could have a larger or a smaller family, or you might have multiple people running in and out of the background and things like Zoom calls. So,
Yeah.
it's important to not make people feel penalized for interruptions or disturbances in the background, and
Yeah.
that's one part of awareness as well.
Yeah.
I absolutely agree. I mean, I think as we talk about the difference with Americans, we're typically used to coming into the boardroom at, exactly 8 a.m. Everyone's got their cup of joe and they're just, communicating in a very, I would say, sterile fashion. And it's interesting because I think things started loosening up a bit before the epidemic started. But you're absolutely right. I think the way we operate business of accepting that diversity in people's different locations, like locations I'm in right now, is going to be a part of our new day. So this is our new normal. It's not, our new normal doesn't necessarily have to be a negative new normal. It could be a positive new normal.
Right. And it's just having that more open mind on that environment. When we first were facing the at-home environment and at the beginning of the pandemic, one of the biggest concerns that we had was the fact that everybody has a different performance environment. I mean, how do we, at the beginning, when we're all required to go into a office, our experience or the area where we performed in was all the same. But as we were forced to go into our homes. Some of us lived in various small apartments when our kids are all at home and we're doing homeschool and sometimes sharing the same space with another spouse that's doing other video calls and so forth. And a very difficult area to perform in. A lot of us were using smaller laptop screens compared to the big screens we're using in our office or whatever. And so it was another shock. And so that's the same thing we need to think about in the cultural area as well. I mean, we're going to be seeing a lot of different environments in a home environment, and that's part of being flexible.
Well, it's interesting. It seems like in the HR world, it's always been perceived that you never want to get too personal with someone's personal life. Asking about marital status, asking about religious status, and all of those rules from an employment law perspective. And so that is kind of an interesting point to now start opening up, oh, I'm not married, I have a boyfriend, or, I don't have children at home, or whatever it is. So you're absolutely right. I think we get to know each other more on a personal level. But also I think it's an element of trust too. But Sumit, you had some thoughts about in other countries about the family, correct? It's like you can ask those kinds of questions in other countries.
Yes. So, and that's an interesting conflicting scenario because based on to give you an example, somebody like me who's largely worked with American companies or their offshoots in India all their life. So I've been schooled on the fact that there are certain questions which are off bounds and you shouldn't really be asking them. But from an overall cultural standpoint, you could be seated next to an absolute stranger on the bus, and within 5 minutes they'll ask you if you're married, you've got kids, how much do you make a year? Do you have you been able to buy a house or not? What kind of car do you drive? And all kinds of questions which a lot of cultures would say are extremely nosy and personal and potentially offensive as well. And of course, as our exposure to the world grows, a lot of Indians are also pushing back and saying, "Hey, no, you can't really ask me that." But yeah, so far a lot of such questions have been fair game.
Mm-hmm. And the reality is that if we're going to be working closely with individuals, we need to know, what holidays they celebrate, for instance, and when do they want their time off? It may be different for other individuals as they celebrate different holidays compared to what may be standard at the business, right? In particular moments. So having that kind of flexibility is important in a multicultural work environment. So
absolutely, and there's some really funny quirks as well. So I was working with an Italian client, and the person got really excited when they heard that I was from India, and he said, "Oh wow, I have got an Indian friend. his name is so and so, and I attended his wedding, and they invited the entire city. So I mean, for an Indian, it's fairly normal to have 500 to 1,000 people at a wedding, and 100, 150 of those would just be your aunts, uncles, first cousins, second cousins, and so on and so
Yeah.
forth.
Well,
That's got to be difficult with all of the COVID restrictions, right?
well, no.
So we do have very stringent restrictions around public gatherings, Shar. The city that I live in, we're restricting weddings and gatherings to not more than 100.
Oh, interesting. Well, 100. We are only at 10.
That's precisely what I'm saying. So people are thinking of it as absolutely draconian, and the government's going bonkers. And how can you restrict a wedding function to just 100 people?
Right.
So yeah, that's quite interesting. So Harold, that's an interesting one in the chat, that Chinese people, red is the color of celebration. So definitely not wearing red to a layoff scenario or a funeral. And similarly with with Indians, white is the color of mourning. So people would be wearing white at someone's funeral, and for an Indian who's traditional, they might not be able to associate with a bride's absolutely colorless dress at a Christian wedding. Just to give you an example.
You know, I was wondering about that. There's some absolutely beautiful gowns in India that I see, and they're so bright and vibrant. So that's extremely fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't know that. I know that CFOs don't like red either, because it means that we're in the red, and so CFOs never like us writing in red. They like us writing in black or blue.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good one to remember when we're doing a business presentation.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
But you know, of course,
Interesting,
there's a lot of these things that we could talk about a lot as far as the, you know, very interesting as far as white being the color of mourning in India versus the United States. Black is what is used in mourning, and exactly opposite is in weddings as well. I mean, it's just it is a starkly different. But as we're oh, and you're about to kind of go on to this, and as I'm looking at your new slide here, the other challenges. What other challenges do we face in multicultural type of environments, Sumit?
So in fact, what we are discussing right now is a great example of some of these challenges, where the first point specifically, differences in culture, language, the way we communicate, they could just be lost in translation. So there can be lots of confusion caused by the wrong choice of language or communication tools, and just the way we write could be offensive. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a country by country kind of a variation. A simple example, or actually, let me pick a country specific example. So, so I've been working with a client from an African country, and even when they send text messages, their text messages usually begin with, "Dear Sumit, we hope you got a restful night's sleep. Good morning." And the message, the WhatsApp or the text message is actually longer than the emails that a lot of people would write.
Yeah.
And the actual message would just be one line somewhere saying, "Have you been able to look at this document yet?" Or "What's your feedback about the email that I sent across to you?" But
that's true. Like like you just mentioned in the U.S., and it's almost the shorter is better. Matter of fact, it's not just in today's culture in the United States, they associate long text messages with older people and shorter text messages with younger people. As a matter of fact, if you're using short text messages with you know the code, then then that means you're really on the edge as far as in your abilities there. So it's different, definitely.
And I would say on the gender side of things, sometimes a communication difference between men and women sometimes, as men tend to be more direct and to the point at times. That's just overall a perception. I'm not saying it's reality.
I think it's
but
reality.
Sometimes when the text is a bit abrupt, there's a lot of offenses that happen. Feelings get hurt, misunderstanding. And actually in the line of business, now that we're moving more and more to a texting society, I think it really makes a huge impact. I mean, if your boss is going to send you a text on a Sunday morning about some report that you need to present on Monday, you can get a lot of anxiety just because of the way the text came across over the weekend.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Absolutely. And so the conflict such situations can create is like the example that I just gave you. It becomes difficult for me to respond the usual way I would normally do, where for me it's absolutely fair to say, hey, so and so, how are you doing? I looked at the email and this is my feedback. And the other person might think of me as a very curt and business-like and maybe even rude individual because I haven't um, gone by their cultural code of being nice and making WhatsApp small talk.
Yeah.
Or asking them about the weather on before getting on with the point. So a lot of these situations can be a little tricky, and one can navigate them in various ways. So one could simply be by setting and managing expectations at a regular frequency, so that people know that you're not being rude if you just write a one-liner and say, hey, I looked at the email and this is my feedback, vis-a-vis writing long notes of having had a good night's rest and so on.
Well, did you say that also in different cultures, they're more community or family or relationship based, where you perceive in the United States, it's not about the community, the family, the relationship, it's professional, it's more direct. Can you describe what you thought about that? As far
Oh,
as
absolutely. So in fact, that's one of the parameters of the model that we'll come to on a subsequent slide. So definitely we'll park that for a couple of minutes later. But specific to the challenges of multicultural teams, so another challenge is the flow of information. And sometimes people who are not at the corporate headquarters, or if the headquarters are located in a different country, might feel that they're being shortchanged or not being treated in an inclusive and equal manner, just because there's some kind of a time delay because of time zone differences, or the fact that it takes a little while for them to get information because they're not right there in the thick of the action, and they're also maybe separated from the leadership who are in a particular area. So that can cause some conflict and some grief, and it can lead to people being less collaborative because they're feeling left out.
So would you agree that if that was a time zone difference, and let's say that the expectation is to get on at 2 a.m. in one location when the business meeting actually starts at 8 a.m., would you not say that some cultures would not be upfront to give the feedback to the leader and say, this isn't really working well for me in the middle of the night?
Some might not, and that actually flows into the next point, where some cultures are a little more paternalistic, so they think of leaders as authority figures who cannot be challenged. So
right.
And specifically some Asian cultures and some African cultures as well, they tend to think of leaders as the sole and supreme authority. So if a leader said, we've got to have a meeting at 8 a.m., it doesn't matter if it's the middle of the night for me, I got to be there. So they'll wait for that instruction. They won't really, they might have water cooler conversations about it and say that how insensitive to schedule meetings like this, but because they're not raising objections and they're religiously attending every such meeting, the leadership might just assume, rightfully so, that everyone's cool with the timings.
Yeah. And that's what I was saying. It's one is making sure that when you work for an organization that you're
I think she doesn't agree with something that I'm saying.
Well, I had a, that's her Zoom
in
call.
alignment with the culture. So or alignment with
I had a meeting with my boss, and he was giving me feedback that I wasn't responding over the weekend. But this is the same boss, vice president, that was having me build presentations and decks on Easter morning on a Sunday at 5 a.m. when I was getting ready for Easter breakfast with my kids. And so all day long, we were working on PowerPoints and presentations. Needless to say, I decided that wasn't the best fit for me anymore. But I never really thought about it from a global perspective and in other locations that way. It's hard enough here in the United States to have the Eastern and the Central and Pacific time zones in itself, let alone that we're 12 hours different or 8 hours different somewhere else.
yes.
So
I mean, then that's a great example of if you're why we really need to know the team and why we need to understand the different cultures and ask those questions and respect and have more tolerance and flexibility around these concepts, because we can, as we're doing more global business, I mean, you can lose top talent just simply by not having respect for those boundaries that a certain culture might put up versus another. Yeah, absolutely.
well, and I think you're absolutely right, because at the time I wasn't very direct with him to give him feedback that was really crossing my personal boundaries. Now that might have been more of a gender thing, and also he was more of an authoritative leader type of personality. But I think it only intensifies when you have more of a multicultural aspect to it. And I would say I think I had pretty good performance, but it definitely affected my ability to be the person with the best talent and have the drive and ambition to really meet the expectation of the company. Because I think we were talking about how this impacts performance overall.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely, and I mean, I'm sure all of us have stories of um, people being insensitive and trying to impose their own work styles on different cultures. Sam was talking about holidays earlier, so it's important to be cognizant of what holiday could be important to your colleague or to your team member, and make sure that you're respecting their time off and not making unnecessary or undue demands on that time.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, as an employee as well, one could potentially take time out to educate other people on the importance of that holiday, which they may or may not be aware of. So one can always spend some time talking about it. So it can be a two-way information flow, and one doesn't necessarily need to wait for leaders to take note of, oh, I've got 10 people on my team from 8 different countries. Let me look up their respective holiday calendars and be aware of which holiday is important to whom before I assign work. One can always proactively comment on that this deadline seems to be on this date, which is very close to a personal holiday of ours that's important to me culturally. So I may not be available. So
Well, I would say, it's interesting that in the last decade, I've worked with companies that actually had a diversity and inclusion director or somebody that was fully accountable for diversity and inclusion. I've seen where it was like just a learning, like some kind of class that you take online through the learning management system, about diversity and inclusion. But I think with all of the changes that are happening now, and as I said earlier, the new normal, the heart-to-heart crucial conversations, to be candid, to be authentic, to really open up the culture to have these kind of conversations is really what the people strategy leaders need to really think about. Setting the stage that is more than just a learning management system tool.
Right.
And I would say even my personal growth in this area has actually been impacted in the last 5 years, as I kind of stepped away from the traditional corporate world and kind of got into some of the people strategy aspects. I think my eyes have been opened even more. And also I think Lisa, who generally joins us, I think she expressed at some point that you have to be open to the feedback. And culturally, you need to be aware that sometimes you may say something offensive. You may not approach something that's very courteous about their cultures. And it's okay to get feedback from your colleagues that, this is something that's not working out well with our organization culturally.
Yeah, I think the point is that we're all learning here.
Absolutely.
And I thought I was being real savvy just by turning on the holidays of different people that were in my company. So for instance, having the holidays of India come up and of Europe and so forth in my calendar. But then I found out there's the holiday every week. So you really have to have a discussion on which are the ones they're really important to the people that work for you. And there's a lot of holidays out there that are minor holidays or days of recognition, but not necessarily a major holiday. So it's important to know.
So are you saying that Halloween is not a major holiday?
I think that's turning into a major holiday across the world just for fun.
Well, I don't know. What is it here in Mexico? Day of the Dead.
Yeah.
So, and that's like 2 days after the Halloween, right? So.
Right.
But Day of the Dead here in Mexico is, really a serious thing. I mean, I had a Uber driver here, and, he was very sensitive to the Day of the Dead because that's how he honors the dead. I mean, he honors his family that way.
Yes, that's
So,
right.
Americans have a tendency to make it a jovial thing and dressing up in costumes and candy and everything else. And it's kind of more of a festive thing. But here in Mexico, it's more serious, So it's very interesting.
Definitely. And like Sam, you said, you can't possibly be looking at multiple calendars and when there's a holiday a week. And I'll give you the Indian example. So we've got, of course, multiple religions and we've got multiple states as well. And so there are lots of holidays which are important to people in a particular state, may not be crucial to the rest of the population. So even if you look at an overall calendar, you might actually not be able to identify all the holidays, and that could cause further conflict among two people from India who you've got on your team, where one person feels left out because they think you're focusing on the other one. You didn't really give them the right kind of importance. So I think for a leader, it could just be simpler and easier to say that, hey, I want to be sensitive to your personal time off, the kind of holidays that you have. Just keep me informed. We'd love to know more about your culture and your traditions. And in case I do make a mistake, I'm more than happy to learn. So we do keep talking about this often, the psychological safety aspect and the fact that people in the team can speak up and say, well, you made a mistake, a big one, and that could potentially be offensive. So no cow references when you're talking to an Indian Shar.
Oh, right. Yeah, I mean, really, you don't even think about it. But you and I, even though we've only had a virtual working relationship here, you feel comfortable enough to joke with me to give me that feedback, right? And sometimes people are afraid to say, hey, you might want to keep aware of this type of comment or behavior.
Right.
And that's a great point, actually, because culture and psychological safety doesn't necessarily mean that you meet face to face and spend time. We've been working together for just a matter of months, but we do have that kind of relationship of psychological safety where we can voice out what our concerns are about work and non-work things as well. And in case a joke is just funny, offensive, potentially offensive, we can definitely talk about that. So I think that's a good one. And just being behind a Zoom call is not an excuse um, to be insensitive about a different culture. So I think that's good to remember. The last one here is more meaningful from the point of view of performance and performance management, because there's certain cultures where being an individual achiever is important, is valued much more, and people take pride in being um, the best of the pack. And there are also certain cultures where winning as a team is considered more important than individual achievements. And so copying and pasting rewards practices from one part of the world to another could have disastrous consequences.
Right.
For example, a country like Japan is likely to have a lot more of a collectivist kind of a culture where um, corporations still talk about a family atmosphere, the fact that we've got to stick together as a team, work together and achieve as a team, versus a country like the US, where someone might possibly be offended if you're trying to prioritize or rather deprioritize their individual achievements and saying that, hey, no, let's talk about the team first. So, of course, some of those aspects are probably changing, but um, just a just a major difference in the way cultures are. And the other day, Sam and I were talking about an Indian example as well, where one of the clients I worked with, um, so what they would do is they would, if you were to achieve your target and get to the maximum cap of variable pay you could earn, uh, they would take some part of your performance and allocate it to somebody who's a non-performer or a lower performer, helping them in reaching their variable pay target. So to certain cultures and to certain to people in certain countries, that could be absolutely criminal, and they would say that you're just encouraging people in the team to become passengers and not pull their own weight. And certain other people might just say, what if the individual had an emergency and they were unable to perform? We have to be sensitive to what they're going through, and it's no skin off anyone's back if uh, you're just helping somebody in earning a little more money.
That's right. Yeah, I think that's why the first step of even putting in a compensation recognition or any types of or variable pay plans. I mean, the first understanding that you need to have is what is the culture of the organization? What is the how do they view teamwork versus individual performance? And what are the objectives, that need to be looked at, and when you're putting a plan like that together. So super important there. I mean, just another story really quick on team versus individual goals. I've been in situations where there's matter of fact, in where I live in Colorado, there's a lot of Native American culture here. So um, sometimes if you put those individuals in a work environment in where they're pointed out individually, such as what is your thoughts on this issue, or what is, if you perform this test, how well do you compare against others? They will almost sabotage themselves so they don't look like they're an outlier from the team. So they will try not to outperform. And but in a team environment, they'll be more inclusive and show their performance in that part of the team to bring over to improve the entire team performance. And they're fine showing their expertise in that environment, but not individually. So it really depends on who's making up the team and how can you work best with those individuals.
Well, I also want to mention another example. My company has recently been focusing on being very much multicultural, and we've hired several Hispanic employees very fluent in Spanish. And actually, from a productivity standpoint, my Hispanic employees are usually more productive than non-Hispanic employees. So particularly one city here in the Denver area is the Aurora area. And Aurora is very multicultural. And it's interesting that the Caucasian males and females don't nearly do as well as our Hispanic females. And so when you talk about the teaming aspect of productivity, I have been trying to change my whole performance management approach and not rely strictly on performance evaluations or pay increases relative to number of widgets that we do. I have now tried to tie this teaming approach using things like the TMA and using the coaching and dialogue to help build a mentorship approach. And so, believe it or not, our very best coaches and mentors in our organization is our Hispanic employees. Which is kind of interesting. Now that I'm in Mexico for the current time being, culturally, you would never really see that kind of work environment. But now that I have an awareness that being very fluent in Spanish or fluent in other languages can be a major asset and actually can drive performance and improve performance. And another point is that often people don't respect that someone is bilingual, don't respect that someone can speak other languages, and not really see that it's actually a talent and a strength in the workplace to help and motivate your team. So that's a whole other topic as far as language.
Right, and to your point, Shar, it's important for us not to oversimplify when we're talking about this too, because we're not saying that certain races or certain cultures or whatever outperform others. It has to do with that particular that cultural standard and what is the best performance environment for that cultural standard that those people share. And so it could be that we're applying the wrong technique in our rewards program for the culture of the people that we're addressing it to. So it's very important to calibrate across the company.
Yeah, particularly when we're representing our communities where we work. So for example, in Aurora, that's a very multicultural city. And then down in the southern parts of Denver, it's less. So it's very fascinating when you're looking at your total rewards and compensation and coaching and processes to make a varying representation of those communities. So with my earlier point about the diversity and inclusion programs, I don't think you really truly understand it until you truly are a leader that's really trying to drive change in your organization.
Right.
So very good points.
Absolutely. And it's like what Einstein once said, that you can't really judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree. So you have to make sure that the way you're measuring performance, the way your performance measures are designed, they allow everyone in different cultures to flourish and to be able to contribute their best. So with that, so this looks like a slightly complicated slide, and we'll not go over it word by word, but the idea is to use a framework created by a Dutch researcher called Hofstede to talk about what are the different kinds of cultural differences that can exist. And this one just uses 4 countries to highlight these differences, but of course, the framework's been used for a variety of countries, and I think it pretty much covers 180 odd nations as of now. So it talks about various aspects like the power distance, which is simply how hierarchical are you? And typically companies in the West are a lot less hierarchical, where it's fairly common for you to be able to invite somebody who's a leader, or the leader to invite you for a couple of beers after work, which could be absolutely unthinkable in a more traditional country. So you're more accepting of hierarchy in certain nations and certain setups, and you do believe that people above a certain level are you can only see them on corporate brochures and in company presentations. Having a one-to-one conversation or inviting them for a chat, absolute no. So that's a high power distance where you yourself put yourself at a fairly high distance from people in authority and people who are leaders.
Right.
The second one is individualism versus collectivism. So there's certain countries where the focus is more on being an individual achiever. And like Shar was saying earlier, there are certain places that are more family oriented and where you've got a shared system of values and beliefs, and you tend to think of not only yourself, but the team, the family, the community a lot more. Sorry, Shar, did you have a point to add here?
Oh, you're on mute, Shar.
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm on mute again. Yeah, I would say definitely that, you know, it's fascinating when I talk about the feminine and masculine side of it too. I mean, when I was mentioning earlier, it kind of goes to the both points, the power distance with the hierarchical, and then also the individual versus collective, and it can affect you from a gender bias as well. So when females communicate, I mean, not to overgeneralize, but it's perceived that it's about relationship, it's about connectivity, it's about talking with many words versus the directness and the authoritative directness. And I think as our communities are now changing, and it's not always the white males that are always in the leadership positions with the authoritative point of view, and now there's more diversity at all levels. I think it ties in nicely with the whole community versus individualism aspect.
Mhm. Yeah, a lot of things. I mean, that's a really good point, and a lot of things to think about here. Just on this, this is a super interesting study. I'm wondering, Sumit, in your experience, do they do this study? I imagine a lot of these factors will change year over year potentially, or have some sort of slow change in different areas. Do you know if it's done on a regular basis?
So I think it's done by different consulting organizations on a regular basis, Sam. The complication here is that even within a country, you've got different kinds of businesses. So to give you an Indian example, uh, there are companies which are very distinctly American that have or Western which have offices in India. Um there are younger modern startups who are started by people who've been educated abroad. And there also are traditional Indian companies which are founder driven or founder led. So there can be differences in them according to who you're looking at. So if you're only looking at the multinationals who're rooted somewhere else and their cultures kind of trickled down to India, you might find them subscribing more to the American way of doing things than to the Indian way. And the ones that are more traditionally Indian, of course, they would not have any context whatsoever of what's the American way of doing business.
Mhm.
So I think there are a lot more subcultures that are emerging, and in any such study, it's becoming more and more important to see what kind of organizations have been surveyed from which country. But overall, I think it's a significant step ahead from earlier generalizations that said um, that Germans are no nonsense and very punctual. The British don't take no for an answer that easily. Indians are lazy. Americans are say isolationist, and they don't really care about other cultures and so on and so forth. So I think this is a great step forward from that. There's another researcher, again from the Netherlands. His name is Fons Trompenaars. I had the good fortune of having a long discussion with him once about culture. So he's also written a couple of books, and he's furthered this research to add a few more parameters. But that model is becoming a lot more complex. However, it does account for other variables. So, Shar, that was an interesting one about the gender aspect. And the third point here, which is masculinity, doesn't really talk about gender differences as such. It just talks more about how certain cultures look to heroes and savior figures, um, and that's supposed to be the more masculine way of doing things. whereas certain cultures are more feminine, where they talk about being modest, being more collaborative, and focusing on not only um, winning, they focus more on the quality of life and the overall work-life balance or integration that one has got. So, of course, when he defined these, he tried to make it binary in terms of gender. So the definition is still used, although, of course, we don't think of gender as a binary anymore. And of course, these traits are no longer associated only with one gender. But this is
Well, that-
where
mhm.
Some nations would be perceived as being more masculine, where the focus is on achievement, and something similar to what we saw in the fisherman and the businessman story. So one of those people was constantly trying to talk up individual wins, getting rich, starting a company, and all that.
Mhm.
Yeah, it's interesting on this because I think this brings up another thing about masculinity and femininity relative to the LGBT community and the diversity of accepting of that, and the fact that that's also part of our multicultural aspect. And I would say some regions are more accepting of that than it is in the other regions as well. But it seems like with all the racial unrest right now, more and more conversations are coming out about this particular topic, such as transgender and accepting of how we can be more supportive. One of my companies actually had a transgender employee that made complaints about that we didn't have enough restrooms, for the fact it's not just about male or female anymore. And about a decade ago, that was a big challenge, but today it's like, well, this is something we as HR leaders and people leaders need to address.
That's becoming an important question. So it's easy to talk about inclusion in presentation slides and in boardroom conversations, but a lot of inclusion is about something that may not even make sense to discuss in a boardroom. So toilet usage, for example, and um, one of my clients recently was asking about how do they actually practice inclusion when there are things about do you have separate facilities for men, women, and people who identify as trans, or what exactly do you do? So my suggestion to them was that do away with the concept of male and female facilities, just have a common pool of facilities, and you can have individual stalls within them, so that which can be used by um, men, women, or trans folks, and should be fairly acceptable to pretty much everyone. So they
Yeah,
were thinking about that.
yeah, that was interesting. The first time I saw something like that was it was on a television show. I think it was maybe in the '90s or something like that. I think it was Ally McBeal or something like that. It was I caught a couple episodes of that, and there was a legal show, and they actually had a restroom in the company office that was shared by both genders, and so basically they would have the wash basins, which was anybody could use, and then they would have the separate stalls or whatever for any gender. So that was the first time I saw that, and I thought it was really interesting, especially at that time when you didn't see that anywhere else.
Well, yes, as an HR leader, I have been in a situation where with that, there was a lack of sensitivity to that particular individual in the organization.
Mhm.
And it was very interesting because it was the senior leaders that were kind of making jokes about it and not taking it seriously. But I think, again, that was maybe 2 decades ago, but today that would not be acceptable at all.
Mhm.
And we have to take it extremely serious. So I think a lot of people, strategists and leaders, are kind of struggling with these topics and
Right.
really aren't thinking of what are the potential solutions in some of those challenges that come up.
Yeah, and exactly, and that's why you really need to know your people and that are working at your company, and to take their concerns seriously. I've had the opportunity to work in a lot of different industries, being a consultant, and of course from anywhere from working on offshore rigs and to corporate environments, and to breweries and restaurants and a lot of different things. And what's important to one environment may not be completely not important to another environment at any particular time. And some of those differences could be offensive to our particular beliefs, but is not offensive in that particular culture. And so we have to consider that in those environments. And so and not bring our own biases into that place. And so it's really important, as I mentioned before, we have to understand the preferences of our teammates and the people that work at our company and those that we're trying to attract, so we can adjust our standards to meet that need.
That is interesting. And Sumit, is this research, as you're looking at this data here, are you finding that there is more research to identify which companies are more multiculturally diverse in acceptance? Is there research to actually show that? Because some companies have a reputation of not being accepting.
That's an interesting one, Shar, and I think companies like Unilever and companies like say GE, which are large organizations that do business worldwide, they're learning to be a lot more cross-cultural, also because their clients are all over. So it's not as simple as a company based in one particular nation and outsourcing a part of their business to a different country, where even though people are based in a different country, they're still serving customers in the parent country. So these companies are having to evolve by looking at how the consumers are different, how that also translates into different skills that are required from their own people. And they're learning to, so it's not necessary to reinvent your entire policy book for every country you do business in. That's humanly impossible, and you'd just end up with so many conflicts. There are certain policies and processes which can be country specific, but largely what needs to change is the messaging. So the way you communicate the same information could just be different, and you can have say performance related rewards in different countries. You can just highlight or play up the team part of it in certain geographies where it's seen as more important, and you can play up the individual achievement angle where it matters more to people. And of course, you can have subtle variations in the dollar amounts as well. So I've worked on culture across different countries as well, and sometimes leaders think of it as a very, very tall order and say that, how am I going to have the same culture across different countries, or will it just not be insane amounts of expense for me to do that? So do we will we be able to run a normal business, or we just keep running around in circles trying to figure out what's the right culture? And the answer, of course, is in the earlier slides that culture does seem to eat strategy for breakfast. So we need to be cognizant of that fact, but it's vital to make sure that you're looking at some of these parameters. So what's the hierarchy like? Are people more collectivistic in that nation, or do they think more in terms of individual achievement? What's the masculinity versus femininity? So are you looking at individual achievers? Are you looking at more of a collaborative and a group kind of thinking? What kind of belief systems do people have? So are they very rigid? Are they relatively flexible with dealing with ambiguity and uncertainty, or do they need everything to be written down, documented, and given to them as a code? Whether people think in the short term or the long term. And the last one, of course, is instant gratification versus delayed gratification. So this could have a bearing on the way you structure your short-term and long-term incentives. And do people want performance-related awards that very fortnight or that very month? Are they willing to wait for a year to be rewarded for great performance,
Right.
or do we find the right kind of balance? So I'm sure Sam would have a lot more to add about performance-related pay and bonuses and stuff like that.
Yeah, no, but this is a good. I mean, I love this conversation because it's important for us to know of these or these issues that may present itself in certain cultures versus others. You know, for instance, you're talking about not being able to rewrite the policy manual for every location, or and so forth, and I found areas where that has led into some issues and may help or may hurt your competitiveness in certain areas. And sometimes that's just a reality of the business in because of the standards you set from a company or a corporate perspective. For instance, in the U.S., there's we have rules that hey, we can't go in and pay bribes to get stuff done, and in other countries and so forth. And so, and then some third world countries, that might be a regular part of just doing business in that country. And as far as, well, if we need to build a building in this community, and if we don't pay this, then we're not gonna get on the expedited schedule to get this done within the time frame that we want to get it done. And so if that's the reality in that particular location, you have to realize that as a business and say, okay, if we're gonna, because we're upholding the standard, we can't expect those people in that location to meet the performance elements that we're putting on them because they have these other, that either spoken or non-spoken constraints. And so we need to recognize that and not penalize them because of that cultural norm in that location. So those are things that need to be considered when we're putting together performance bonuses and things that they may in fact be different. We can't expect performance in one location to be as high as other locations because of certain cultural norms that exist.
Yeah, and I think that's very fascinating. I think what comes to my mind is also getting the executive buy-in about why we want to be more multicultural and also be more accepting in this space. And I think as people strategists, it's important to try to tie the metrics of why having a culture that is accepting and multicultural and global can actually drive performance, can actually have a return on investment, and also that certain employees are not driven just by money. So back to the executive buy-in, I think the chief financial officer or the financial executives of the company, it's like, how do you take the aspect of multicultural diversity and translate it to really show that this is a very cost-effective thing? That it's going to improve employee engagement. It's going to change the culture overall, which is ultimately going to drive the metrics of the organization.
Right.
And I think as an HR leader, and I have to say, even in my personal competency, is to have that focus of really translating what that means. And I think a report like this is phenomenal. I think you go into the executive team and say, take a look at this data here. Take a look at all these aspects within these categories. Let's take a look at our organization. And it's not just an employee engagement survey that we're going to get this type of information.
Absolutely.
If you were to break this down, yeah, go ahead, Sumit.
No, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, Shara.
Oh, you're so courteous. Oh, go ahead, Sumit.
So I was saying that it also depends on among your values, which ones are your non-negotiables. So almost 15 years ago, I used to work for GE, and they were relatively new in India at that point. And Sam, this speaks to your example of having to pay a bribe. So they'd set up a new building and a new office. So to get the certification to occupy the building, there are government officials who would charge you a certain bribe and say that without that you would not have the necessary permission, so will not release your electricity connection. And of course, I mean, you're um, absolutely handicapped without a power connection. So GE refused to pay that bribe, and they said, "Fine, we'll just run the building on backup power using generators until we get the permission." So it took them 3 years. They put pressure on all possible officials. They filed lawsuits, and they didn't compromise on that value. And eventually, of course, it was a huge drain on their finances um, to run the organization like that. But eventually they won the lawsuit, they got compensation, and it became one of the most enduring stories of how they stuck to one of their core values and did not compromise. So I think a value like, say, customer centricity could have different definitions in different cultures depending on various nuances. So of course you have to be customer centric, but the way you do it could be different. Values such as honesty, integrity, um, of course, would have to stay rigid no matter where you're operating. So I think that's probably something the company will have to spend time in. And yes, of course, there are certain industries where this kind of a scenario would still be impossible, and just by the nature of business, you probably wouldn't get too far if you didn't indulge in lobbying and I mean, traditional businesses like, say, oil and gas, they're known for some of these practices, especially in some of the tougher regions of the world. And I don't think um, any company can go strictly by the values they claim to uphold. So that could be different, but um, typically, I think companies would need to focus on some of these aspects. And I mean, I also have a few suggestions on how to navigate through some of these cultural pillars as well. So if you talk about the hierarchy part of it, how does it impact performance? There are certain places in the world where you could be, as a leader, you could be saying anything at all. People will keep nodding and seemingly agreeing with you. But deep inside their hearts, they're saying, this is absolute nonsense. I'm not doing it. So they would seemingly accept a leader's logic and their explanation and go by whatever they're saying, and they would wait for instructions. So there are certain places, certain cultures, it's fine to take charge and say, I thought this is the right thing to do, so I just went ahead and did it. What do you think about it? Certain places, if you ask for progress after 10, 15 days, the person would say, you didn't ask me to do anything. Was I supposed to do something about it? And you might just find performance slipping through the cracks somewhere if some of these expectations are not really set. And the last one, of course, the last point here is an interesting one of certain places where they've got different lunch tables and different cafeterias for leaders and the have-nots. So the haves and the have-nots eat separately. And I've been part of one such scenario where a client wanted me to eat in the non-executive lounge because their own facility was out of bounds. So it can make a person feel less valued in a customer or a client situation like that, and it really depends on what's your stance as a leader. So I'm still grateful to the leader that I was working with. So even though I had my share of disagreements, I didn't really think they were um, really brilliant overall, but I really respect them for standing up to the client and saying that either my team and I, we eat at the same place, or we're fine with stepping out and eating at a completely different restaurant or someplace nearby if you find this doesn't agree with some of your belief systems. So that really, really motivated all of us to put in our best and to kind of live up to the belief that the leader had shown in being inclusive towards us. So potentially very minor point. It was just one lunch you could have had anywhere, but um, the way a leader handles such situations could be extremely critical.
Right. Totally agree. Yeah.
And we did talk about individual versus collective performance earlier, and in certain cultures, asking for help could be seen as there's a sense of shame associated with it. In certain places, it's the done thing to ask somebody else to step in, maybe even spend extra time guiding you about a certain topic, and the person would be more than happy to do that. And um, especially in some of the eastern countries, it's fairly common where you can completely rely on a person who's not even part of the project team to guide you about certain aspects, and they'll be more than happy spending personal time with you, helping you solve problems without any sense of shame, or without any sense of you yourself being incompetent or inadequate in problem solving. um, so we did speak about the gender aspect of it, but this is more about trying to be a hero. And again, the Indian example of this is we wear it like a badge of pride that, oh, I send out emails at 4 a.m. in the morning on a regular basis. So it's seen as uh, the mark of being a great employee if you're regularly spending long hours at work, if you're sending out emails at all kinds of crazy hours. Personally, I've known people who use the Microsoft Outlook scheduling feature to make sure that they're sending out emails at like 2 a.m. in the night just to be seen as somebody who works that hard. Um, and you'd also hear this fairly commonly in rewards and recognition situations where a leader's praising an employee for the great contribution, and finally adding a line saying, I regularly see this person sends out emails at 2 a.m. So for all you know, the person might be taking 10 or 15 cigarette breaks during the day, um, and spending time away from their desk. But hey, they were in office till 2 a.m. And there also are organizations that provide free pizza to people who stay after 8 p.m. So that's just an organization feeding into more of a masculine culture, as what
Right.
Hofstede would say.
Mhm.
So how to motivate such people? Now, of course, if you're trying to, as a consultant, if you're trying to revamp the culture and you say, um, we're trying to get rid of bad habits, so no more pizza for you, it's only going to upset people, because all of a sudden leaders are not going to say everyone goes home early. You're still expected to sit at the time you committed to, but you're not getting any free pizza or soft drinks with that. So that can be a complex problem to solve, and it has to be done through some level of educating people, through some level of discussions, and um, trying to show them there's value in going home in a timely manner, investing time in other activities as well, and making sure that you're focusing on physical and mental wellness as well, in addition to the great work that you're putting in.
Right. There's no one size fits all way to fix these issues. It's really dependent upon the company and its culture, right? So you have to think
Oh,
about.
absolutely, and also their willingness to do that, Sam. I mean, uh, if you're getting 4 hours of extra work from an employee, I'm sure as a leader you'd be more than happy giving them free pizza all life long. Free pizza, unlimited Coke for you. Stay on 4 hours extra. That's fine. Um, and when we
I
talk
just want to
about,
make a brief comment. When I was
sure,
working for
sure.
Here I am. I was working with a female leader, and when I was new to an HR manager position, and I was working late every night. I was working till 6 o'clock at night or 7 o'clock at night. And one day she comes walking up, catches me in my office working super late, and she gave me some very gracious feedback in a very nice way with compassion that it really didn't appear that I was working very smart, or I was, working harder, not smarter, Also, it was kind of becoming annoying and offensive to the other people that were going home on time every day. But then my next male leader, the VP, had a very different opinion. He was very much about working weekends, working late at night, and that's, because that's how you get performance done. And so I don't know if it's always a gender thing, but I think that there's definitely more of an awareness about, the EQ aspect, the emotional intelligence aspect of having, the sensitivity to people's life outside of work. And so I definitely think that's changed.
But I agree. I think there's definitely a gender thing to it across different cultures as well. And I've been part of organizations where people would, I've seen managers would be unwilling to recruit women because women would typically be more demanding of the need to go home on time, because at least in the Indian context, a woman performs a lot more roles than just being an office employee. So they do have things to do at home, and typically a lot of childcare and even cooking responsibilities are taken up by women. So a woman simply cannot afford to be in office at 8 or 9 p.m. And so there were managers who'd say that I don't want a woman on the team because they don't stretch beyond regular hours, and they're just always looking for ways to get home early. So crazy, but yeah, well, that's.
Yeah, exactly.
So there's also the uncertainty avoidance angle, where you might, to get high performance out of people, you might have to be a lot more clear about what the performance goals and expectations are. There's certain cultures where you just assign a goal, people will take your word for it and go out and start working. But one can build in dialogue and make sure that people not only understand, they're also willing to check in at regular intervals about what's working well, what's not working well, and are there any kinds of unwritten rules and norms for communication. So there are certain countries where in a group setting, people will not speak up and challenge an authority figure. So it's fine to invite them to a one-to-one later, or leaders might have to figure out creative ways to get people to speak up. Because in a group setting, and again, Indian example, so even so you taught that right from a school classroom. A lot of children will not ask questions or challenge a teacher in a class. They might step out afterwards and say that, hey, I had a question about what you were teaching earlier. Do you mind if I ask you one? And so it's inculcated from an early age, and that respect for authority figures can go into just accepting what another person is saying without any kind of question.
That's definitely not always the case in the education system here in the United States. I think I think Sam could attest to this, being married to a teacher. Sometimes some kids can be fairly disrespectful and distract the entire learning process. So I think that is definitely a difference between cultures.
It is, and again, traditional cultures like India, we're still we're kind of dealing with reverse ageism in the sense that just because somebody elder to you is saying something, or somebody with gray hair is saying something, you gotta trust them a little more. That's why I decided to grow the beard, because I don't seem to have too many gray hair on my head. When people see gray,
well, the ageism side, we had a guest speaker before, Barbara and Guadalupe, that talked about the ageism diversity as well. That is an entirely different topic. So that is very fascinating. But I want to say we have about 3 minutes left before we end our forum today. So I know you have several more slides, right? Right, Sumit?
This one's the absolute last shower.
Oh, okay. All right. What do you want to say on this one?
So this one's about instant versus delayed gratification, and this might have an impact on how coaching works and how we can prioritize work-life balance, because this is where people feel a sense of having earned their own free time. So in a country like India, you'd always be taught the importance of delayed gratification. So you're in school, you'll be told just work hard, get into a good college, and life would be smooth after that. You get into college, you'll be told just work hard, you get a job, life would be smooth. So you keep getting tuned to the cycle of delayed gratification, and you don't really focus on a project based or a here and now kind of thing. So how do you motivate people to say that I'm giving you the promise of interesting work today, work that engages you and the workforce experience, and not really the promise of an analyst to a partner kind of a journey over 10 years. So that's how the narrative is changing. So I'll stop with that and just say that it might sound complicated, but it's relatively easy to have multicultural awareness. And the starting point simply is, whenever in doubt, just ask. So just be aware that there are different cultures. In case you've got a doubt, feel free to ask. If you do make a mistake, and all of us do at various times, serious mistakes or minor ones, it's absolutely fair and fine to just own up and say, hey, I think I screwed up. More than willing to change. Just help me and guide me on how to make myself better.
Well, this has been absolutely fantastic. I have to tell you that I think these are very sensitive topics to talk about, and sometimes they're not easy to talk about. So I appreciate this presentation and your insight, Sumit. I think there's just a whole different element of the multicultural awareness. We could probably do a whole second discussion on this conversation, but now it's 11 or 10:30, I guess. It's 11:30. Where am I? So now we're about to wrap up. I'm in Mexico, that's why I don't know what time it is. So let's just say thank you so much. And I noticed the people that hung on with us here, thank you for listening. And you can always hear this presentation recorded and on compteam.net. So we look forward to seeing everyone next week, Wednesday Mountain Time. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Great. Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
All right. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.